I am David. I'm at best average looking at 5 feet 9 inches tall. I was accused of being a nice guy by several girlfriends in high school as they each dumped me for bums who stole cars or sold drugs. Several of the girls became pregnant from the bad guys, who immediately left them. Then all of a sudden, they sought out decent guys to marry and help them raise the bum's child. I've never understood why being honest and decent was such a bad thing to some women. I met Deborah, my incredibly gorgeous wife who is also 5 feet 9 inches tall with long black hair and a body to kill for, when we were both 18 and in our first semester in college. It was at a party on the last day before Christmas break. She was so beautiful in that tight black turtleneck dress that I was afraid to approach her. She had just come in from the frigid Philadelphia cold, and I was consumed by a desire to kiss her snow-covered rosy cheeks. My friends dragged me over to her and introduced us. We danced. I smelled her hair, and it was all over for me. I understood that I was punching way above my weight, but I was too hopelessly infatuated, or maybe in love, to worry about it. She, her mother, and her sister, Carol, left the frigid Philadelphia winter and traveled on Christmas vacation to Miami Beach the next day. Her father had abandoned his family without a word for a younger woman when Deborah was 13. He walked out of the house one day and never returned. Never again spoke to his wife or daughters. Deborah never got over her neurotic fear of abandonment, I would later realize. When she returned to school in January, we were inseparable. She clung to me like a lifeline, only letting go to walk into her classrooms. But she couldn't stop talking about her water skiing lessons in Miami that she and her sister took, and especially Joey, the strong instructor who lifted her up with one hand around her waist. She seemed angry that Joey dated her sister Carol and not her. I was jealous but said nothing. What could I say? I realized that I was second, if that, in her heart, but I was sure that in time I could work my way up to number one. Okay, I was a dumb, excited, love-struck teenager who thought sweetness and caring mattered to a girl like Deborah. Deborah has always been ultra-high maintenance. She has always needed to be the center of my life every single second. I can't tell you how many times she's yelled at me for not paying enough attention to her while I was talking on a phone or driving on a freeway and trying to keep us all alive. The first week after we returned home from our honeymoon was a nightmare. Deborah was crying hysterically every evening when I came home from my job managing real estate. She seemed on the verge of a nervous breakdown, and if she didn't have one, her nonstop crying would soon give me one. She claimed that I abandoned her. It's not like I was at a club getting drunk and dancing. I was at work. I understood that my marriage was over unless I quit my job and found something we could do together. I loved her so much that I was willing to totally upend my life to make her happy and save our marriage. My sister owned a real estate management business in Los Angeles. When I explained my dilemma, she offered Deborah and me jobs. So, Deborah and I moved to Los Angeles, and I never had to leave Deborah's side. Joining that business was the best financial decision we ever made. We made a lot of money, but because we spent so much of it on lawyers, I went to law school so we could save that money. Several women law students came on to me and were very clear that they wanted to sleep with me. They didn't care that I was married, but I cared that I was married. I told them they were gorgeous and I was flattered, but I didn't fool around on my wife. None of them were impressed by my integrity and fidelity. They were pissed off at me because they didn't get what they wanted. One of them, the prettiest one, spread rumors that I must not a straight man. After she gave herpes to 3 other students, no one cared about her gossip, and I was grateful that I dodged that bullet. I took 4 years instead of 3 to graduate, because if I carried a full load of classes, my wife would freak out that I was gone too long and she had been alone. One night after work, and after a few drinks, my sister asked me how I put up with my wife's controlling bullshit. It's easy, I replied. She's the greatest lover I've ever had. My sister spit out her drink on the table through her nose. What are you talking about? She's the only lover you ever had. I shrugged my shoulders. I guess it's the same thing. In all the years of dating and marriage to my wife, I always put her and our children first. Except for 2 months when I locked myself in the guest bedroom of our home to study for the California bar examination to become a lawyer. I still had 3 meals a day with them, but I spent the rest of my waking hours studying. With my sister, we owned a successful real estate management company together. So, we didn't have any financial problems with me taking 2 months off, though it did place an added burden on my wife and sister. My sister was very supportive because of all the money the company would save when I became a lawyer. My wife had given birth to Jeff, our second child, 4 months before, and like after the birth of our first child, Steve, my wife went into a postpartum depression. Unlike after the birth of our first child, I wasn't much help, so I hired a live-in nanny to help my wife while I studied. Deborah spent a lot of time crying and claiming that I deserted her and no longer loved her. We stopped having closeness because I had to keep my focus on my studies. I couldn't get the books out of my head long enough to have closeness with my wife. I felt awful about it, but it was just for a few more weeks. My wife didn't take it very well. She even suggested that I stop studying and forget becoming a lawyer. I tried to explain that this was temporary, and we would make up for this lost time after the bar exam. But that didn't help. I could see how much she resented me, but I refused to forget the bar exam and throw away 3 years of law school just to mollify my clingy, neurotic wife. I just needed a few more weeks. I wanted to tell her to grow up, but I didn't. That might have ended my marriage, or maybe fixed it. Bad news sometimes comes in threes. A few hours later, we received the phone call that my wife's grandfather died. She flew back to the East Coast with the baby for the funeral, while I continued to study and take care of our 4-year-old with the help of my sister and parents. Deborah's sister Carol and brother-in-law, Joey, also flew in from Florida. Joey was an incredibly handsome 6 feet 3 inch failed actor, bodybuilder, water ski instructor who became a con man, seducing then fleecing old ladies out of their life savings. Joey met his future wife and my future wife at the same time in Miami, a few days after Deborah and I first met. Joey, a water skiing instructor, broke my then girlfriend's heart by choosing her sister Carol and not Deborah. She clearly still had the hots for him, and I was always on guard when they were together. Only now I was 3,000 miles away and powerless. This was before cell phones. I phoned her at her grandparents' house at least 3 times a day, and I could tell that something was wrong. All she said was, "Joey did this," or "Joey said that." One afternoon when I phoned, I learned that my wife had left the baby with her sister and wasn't there. She left over an hour earlier to drive her brother-in-law back to his motel, a few miles away, to get something he forgot. I was worried and upset that his wife didn't drive him. I called back an hour later, and they still hadn't returned. I tried not to dwell on the obvious signs of cheating. There was nothing I could do, except have a nervous breakdown and flunk the bar exam. Deborah phoned me a half hour later, and I was furious. "Why were you doing with your brother-in-law at a motel for more than 2 hours?" She claimed that we're only talking, and then she got lost for over an hour. "Why didn't you phone your grandmother and get directions?" "I didn't think of that." She weakly responded, "Don't do it again, unless you want a divorce." I yelled and hung up. By the time she returned 2 days later, I had calmed down and was again absorbed in studying. My wife cried the whole way back from the airport. "You deserted me. I felt all alone. I can't stand to be alone. Joey was right. You didn't love me or care about me, or you would have stopped studying and come with me to the funeral. Joey would never have deserted me like you did because Joey cares about me. If you had come to the funeral, then things would have been different." I wasn't really listening attentively. I was driving in one of those rare rainstorms in LA with limited visibility. Cars were fishtailing all over the flooded freeway, and I had to concentrate on my driving so we would make it home alive. "You're not looking at me or listening to me." "No, I'm looking at the road," I screamed. I passed the bar exam. My sister was over the moon happy for me, but my wife didn't care. We never got back the spark we had before the bar exam preparation, though I tried hard to please her and make her happy. I took her out to expensive restaurants every weekend, not to mention a trip to Hawaii. Nothing worked or brought us closer together. 4 years later, my ex-brother-in-law, who was now divorced from my sister-in-law, reached out to my wife in a phone call. She slammed the phone down on the receiver and collapsed onto the living room floor, crying hysterically. I brought her a tissue and glass of water. I assumed that someone, maybe her sister, had died. Deborah cried for another 10 minutes onto my shoulder with her arms around me. She kept repeating that she loved me, but that she was very confused and didn't know what to do, which confused the hell out of me. Finally, Deborah admitted that during her trip back east to her grandfather's funeral, she had closeness with Joey. I think there's a script that cheating wives all use. It didn't mean anything. It was just sex. I always wanted him, and it was an itch that I just had to scratch again. Again? I wondered. Joey had been indicted for fraud and called to blackmail her for $25,000 in cash to keep his mouth shut about their tryst. Was it worth it? I asked. Was he that good in bed? Her smile cheated her. When you and I have sex, it's about love. This was different. It was forbidden. It was exciting. And finally, the truth escaped her lips. Sex with Joey was the greatest sex I ever had in my life. Once she started telling the truth, the words came pouring out of her. "He's such an alpha male. He doesn't make love to me. He overpowers me and does whatever he wants to me. He never takes no for an answer. You're just too sweet and gentle. He's a real man, an alpha male, and I'm sorry to say, you aren't. You're a beta and just not sexually exciting to me." That revelation destroyed me. "Was this the only time you slept with him?" I asked, even though I was afraid of the answer she had previously hinted at. No, she admitted while looking at the ground and not into my eyes. I slept with him when we vacationed in Puerto Rico with Joey and my sister. That admission completely shattered my heart. That was the week when my wife became pregnant with our oldest son. Now I understood why my wife was so turned on and passionate that week. I wanted a child and hadn't used protection that week. We made love several times a day for that week, which was totally out of character for her, who would barely make love to me twice a month without enormous coaxing. That week was the best sex I ever had. Now I realized that she wasn't turned on by me, the sun, or the sand, but by the time she was spending with Joey. I swear those are the only 2 times I was unfaithful in our marriage. She paused and tilted her head to the left. A smirk engulfed her face. Except for the times when I flew to New York to visit my girlfriend, Catherine. Joey would fly up from Miami to meet me. I realized that she wasn't confessing, she was bragging. "We can get past this," she sobbed. I brought her more tissues like the chicken she accused me of being. The discovery that I had never been my wife's number one or most important person destroyed me. Though I had occasionally suspected as much, I always pushed that thought out of my mind. Now I couldn't. Now I was defeated and destroyed. Why didn't you leave me for him so I could find a woman who was in love with me? I couldn't do that to my sister, she said. Besides, he'd be a terrible father. I didn't want him raising my children. I wanted you to raise them because you're so loving and caring and honest. Our marriage wasn't about us. It had never been about us. It was always about them. I've read that everyone's life is like a movie in which they are the star. Now I discovered that I wasn't the star of my movie. I was at best a supporting actor, more likely a bit player. Everything I had believed about my marriage was a lie. Had I been too trusting or too stupid? I thought of the songs, "Everybody's Somebody's Fool," and "Everybody Plays the Fool." I kept picturing myself placing my hands on her neck and squeezing the life out of her while I listened to her gasp for breath. While I still had some self-control, I needed to get out of there before I did something violent and stupid. "I need some time to think," I said as I packed a bag and left the house. I spent the rest of that day at a hotel crying my eyes out. I can give you a dozen good reasons why I shouldn't have still loved her, but I did. I didn't follow the custom of getting blindly drunk and puking my guts out as a result. I skipped the part of having any liquor and just puked my guts out that night because of emotional pain. I decided to do a DNA test on both of my sons before I would decide to stay married or get a divorce. Of course, they would always be my sons, but whether their mother would remain my wife was in question. I returned home the first thing in the morning to find a note taped to the refrigerator. The children were at my parents'. Deborah could no longer live a lie. She loved me, but she was never in love with me, she claimed. She always imagined she was having sex with Joey when we slept together. She never enjoyed sex with me after sleeping with Joey. Joey was huge. She was divorcing me and flying to Florida to be with Joey. I know he won't be found guilty. He's too smart, and he found a way to beat the system. I'm sorry for you, but he's always been the love of my life. Try to find a way to tell the children without making me look bad. I contacted the banks and learned that Deborah had withdrawn $25,000 in cash this morning. I removed all the remaining money from our joint accounts and placed them in my name only. Then I canceled all of our credit cards. Joey is a thief, down to the bone. He would rather steal $1 than work for $100. I knew it was just a matter of time before he did end up in prison. I wondered if when that happened his cellmate, Bubba, would consider Joey an alpha male or just Bubba's bitch. I wondered if my ex-wife would be dumb enough to involve herself with his felonious activities and also end up in jail. I thought the odds were 50 to 50. I was consumed with getting revenge. I wanted to fly to Fort Lauderdale and beat the shit out of Joey. Unfortunately, Joey was a weightlifter twice my size. I'd be the one who ended up in a hospital. Then I thought of flying to Fort Lauderdale, buying a gun and blowing his brains out. That idea was no good because it would leave my children as orphans. Unless, of course, the jury acquitted me. Maybe there would be one juror whose wife left him, and he would cause a hung jury. But what are the odds of that, unless I had some other way to guarantee it? I'm not a crook, but Joey is. I wondered what he would do, and that's when it hit me. That's what the $25,000 was for. It was to bribe a juror. That was the loophole he found to assure his acquittal. My wife was still airborne on her way to Florida, so I had to act fast. I phoned the district attorney's office in Fort Lauderdale, and after a half hour on hold, at long-distance rates, I spoke with the prosecutor on Joey's case. I explained that my soon-to-be ex-wife was flying to Florida with $25,000 in cash. I believed Joey was going to use this money to bribe a juror. I suggested that the DA have a detective follow my wife from the airport and learn which juror she was going to bribe. I described what my wife looked like, what her unique Gucci luggage looked like, and her flight information. I suggested they check the name tags on luggage before they entered the luggage carousel. That way they could identify my wife when she picked up her luggage. The next morning, Deborah phoned begging me to bail her out of jail. I hung up on her. The DA phoned me later that day. He couldn't tell me anything other than to thank me for the information. Every day for the next week, I went to a newspaper stand that sold out-of-town newspapers. I read in the Miami Herald that Joey, his lawyer, my wife, and a juror were arrested for jury tampering, conspiracy to commit jury tampering, bribery, etc., etc., etc. I told my children that their mother had abandoned us, but I didn't tell them why. Of course, they were devastated, though strangely my older son didn't cry, but I could see the light in his eyes go out. I stood in my bathroom with the unopened DNA test in hand. I already knew my soon-to-be ex-wife was a cheater. I didn't need a DNA test to prove that. I loved my sons and didn't care what some chemical test indicated. I knew that Joey never fathered children with his several wives or various girlfriends. There was no evidence that his boys could swim. Why tamper with the love my sons and I shared? I thought. I threw the unused test kit into the basket. I walked into the kitchen and made them scrambled eggs for breakfast. I didn't know how to make waffles, or pancakes, or really anything else. I pushed the question of their biological paternity permanently out of my mind because I was their father in every important sense of the word. You can call me a beta male, a chicken, or just a schmuck. But in my heart of hearts, I just see myself as an average dad. A dad who, like most dads, would never harm his children, physically or emotionally. I filed for divorce on grounds of abandonment. I bought out her share of our house and the business for pennies on the dollar and sent her that money for bail and lawyers' fees. She also agreed to terminate her parental rights. The thing about low-life scum is that they never change and turn on one another when it's convenient. Joey claimed that this whole bribery plan was my wife's idea. The allegation stuck because she was the one who had the money and handed it to the juror. Joey was too smart to do that himself. He was miles away with an alibi when it happened. He testified against Deborah in return for a reduced sentence. The stupid love-struck bitch couldn't believe that the love of her life would stab her in the back and sell her down the river so easily. That crushed her more than the 10-year prison term she received, and that was the best revenge I could have possibly imagined, coming not from me, but from the so-called love of her life. I never heard from her again. I put my children in therapy, but it only helped a little. They cried and acted out for months because they badly missed their mother. They blamed me and themselves for destroying our family because I never told them whole truth. One day the therapist did tell them the full story, and it was a turning point for them. They realized that neither they nor I were the cause of their mother's abandonment, and things started to get better for their mental health. I did the best I could as a single father, but my sons insisted that I needed a wife to take care of me and help take care of them and make them a breakfast other than scrambled eggs. I'm not much of a cook. I declined to date. I couldn't bear the thought of any more heartache. I also felt that my kids had enough emotional problems without me bringing a new woman into the picture while they were this young. My sons disagreed. They rented the movie Sleepless in Seattle to show me what life could be like if I started dating. We three were at my youngest son's t-ball game when my older son took me by the hand and led me over to a really attractive dark-haired woman about 5 years younger than I was. Dad, this is Janet Samuels. She's my friend's mom, and she's my 5th grade teacher, and she's also the sweetest woman on earth. Her husband died in Iraq. She's a widower who deserves a good husband like you. Mrs. Samuels, my dad is divorced. My mom abandoned us and ran off with her sister's husband. She broke his heart, and mine too. He wiped his eyes. He's doing the best he can, but he's a nightmare in the kitchen. My brother and I are so sick of scrambled eggs and burnt toast every morning. He desperately needs and deserves a good wife and my brother, and I need a mother like you. Then he walked away trying not to cry. Janet walked over to him and gave him a big hug. He hadn't cried when his mother left us. I think he stored those tears until he felt it was safe to let them flow. I miss my mother so much. How could she leave me? He cried uncontrollably in Janet's arms for a long time, kissed her on the cheek, and then walked away to his brother. When Janet turned to me, I took and kissed both of her hands. It seems like my son is an excellent judge of people. Thank you for being so sweet to him. Janet had a smile that melted and began to heal my cold, broken, abandoned heart. After a few dates, I splurged and took her out for the best pizza in town. With my mouth filled with mozzarella cheese, I asked what she wanted in a boyfriend or husband. He has to be super rich, super tall, and fulfill my every demand, sexual or otherwise, while lavishing attention on me 24/7. I froze. She was just another Janet. She continued. And he has to be okay with my terrible secret. My jaw dropped. I wanted to drive her home and run away, or maybe just run away. Then Janet put her hand on my shoulder as she laughed. My terrible secret is that on the weekends I perform stand-up comedy at comedy clubs. How else can I put up with a classroom full of 5th graders and remain sane? I think that was the first time I'd laughed since D-Day. Of course, then I realized she was kidding about her romantic expectations. Every evening Janet kissed our kids goodnight as she put them to bed and told them that she loved them. I realized that my previous wife rarely did that. As much as I loved Janet, the kids loved her more. One day I was giggling and playing with Janet, our 3 sons, and our new golden retriever puppy, Lola, in our backyard. We gave her that name because whatever Lola wants, Lola gets. I suppose she's the alpha dog in our relationship. As I lay on my back in the grass, with the sun shining on us, I alternated tickling Janet's pregnant tummy and our children when the puppy licked my face. I realized how happy we all were and, mercifully and instantly, by the grace of the Almighty, I was able to let go of all the suffering, the hate, and the pain I still harbored for my ex-wife. I also gave up the humiliation I felt from her calling her lover an alpha male, and me a lesser beta. I finally recognized that this wasn't about alpha and beta. It was about a decent, loving husband and father versus a sociopathic a-hole criminal. I realized that I did have my revenge. I was happy, and that's the best revenge, and ultimately the only revenge that matters. In fact, my hatred towards my ex-wife turned to gratitude because her infidelity led me to Janet, a better wife, a better mother, and a better marriage. Now let's listen to the second story. I'm Tim. Lenore, the love of my life, and my wife of 5 years, and I were having lunch at Sinatra's Bistro in Manhattan, where we worked the dinner shift as servers. The background music was always records of Frank Sinatra singing. This time he was singing "You're Nobody Until Somebody Loves You." At the crucial moments in my life, a Frank Sinatra song that perfectly described the situation was always playing on the radio or at the restaurant. Though I also love rock music, Frank is still my favorite singer. I first asked Lenore, my brown-haired beauty, to marry me when we were 10 years old. She said we were too young, but to ask her again when we were all grown up, like maybe when we were 15 years old. We married the week we graduated high school, and we're on top of the world. We had waited until marriage before we were intimate, which was on our honeymoon in Atlantic City. We didn't drink or gamble because we were too young, and besides, those forms of entertainment held no allure for us that week. We had better and more pleasurable ways to pass the time. I think it rained the whole week. There was no way for us to know since we never left the room. Thank goodness for room service. I do remember that after we checked out, we bought boxes of salt Walter Taffy and Steele's fudge for our parents. At first, we lived in a tiny apartment on top of her parents' garage, but to us it was our Shangri-La. We both worked, saved money, and within a year had our own apartment. We both worked as servers at an upscale restaurant in Manhattan called Sinatra's. Unsurprisingly, the background music was strictly Frank Sinatra. It was owned by the father of Lenore's best friend Susan. Susan was the maid of honor at our wedding, and Lenore was the matron of honor at Susan's wedding to Billy, a private in the Army. We had a steady stream of regular customers who told us we were adorable. The pay was minimum wage, but the tips were very good and more often than not, even generous. A half hour ago, we had just left the office of Lenore's obstetrician. We were over the moon happy with the confirmation of my wife's pregnancy. I'd never been so happy in my life. We shared the good news with all our coworkers at the restaurant. With each of us holding a glass of water, we toasted to our upcoming baby. Then my wife twisted her head and put her right hand on her forehead. I just got a blinding head. My wife didn't finish the sentence as she fell over from her chair. I raced around the table to grab her before she hit the ground. I was too late. I yelled at Susan, the manager, to call an ambulance. Lenore wasn't breathing, and I tried to give her mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, but it wasn't working. I checked her pulse, but she had none. I remembered a scene in a movie and pounded on her chest, but there was no response. Later, I learned that she had suffered an undetectable brain aneurysm and was dead before her body hit the ground. She had always been the center of my life, and I didn't know how I could live without her. I spent the next 3 months drunk or stoned on cannabis wanting to die. I rarely showered and never shaved. I was beyond consolation. My parents paid my bills, and my restaurant's manager, Susan, and her husband brought me food every few days. Metaphorically, each day I was trying to dig myself into a hole in which to bury myself. One day I saw myself in the mirror and vomited at the sight of what I had become. That was the moment I hit rock bottom, and the only way out was to stop digging. I showered for an hour, shaved, and realized that I had to go on with my life, not so much for myself, but because that was what Lenore would want. I traveled to the grave of my unborn child and my wife. I confessed that I had tried unsuccessfully to drink myself to death, but now I was going to get sober and get on with my life. Find a reason to live, and I hoped she would forgive me for surviving. I met Vivian 2 years after Lenore's death when I took dance lessons in anticipation of my sister's wedding. Vivian was tall and had the grace of a dancer. I too was tall, but had the grace of a three-legged elephant. Her long brown hair flowed as she danced. The first song to which we danced was, at my suggestion, Frank Sinatra singing, "Come Dance With Me." She was the only woman I'd ever held in my arms other than my late wife. I felt guilty that I enjoyed it. Vivian had convinced me that I needed a lot of dance lessons. Even though I knew she worked on commission, I knew she was right about my dance skills. I had no sense of rhythm. By the time we were done, I could dance to a foxtrot without being an embarrassment, but only if Vivian led and guided me in the dance. We practiced to Frank singing, "Let's Fall in Love." I took Vivian to the wedding as my date. My sister arranged for the band to play the only song to which I could dance, "Let's Fall in Love," so Vivian and I could dance to it. I almost looked like I knew what I was doing during the dance. My family loved her. I loved her. For the first time since Lenore died, I no longer wanted to die. 8 months later, we married. My wife and Carl, her incredibly handsome boss who owned the dance studio where she worked, choreographed the groomsmen and bridesmaids dance down the aisle at our wedding. Carl wanted to end the procession by copying the last dance scene in Dirty Dancing where Baby flies through the air into Patrick Swayze's arms. He looked a lot like Swayze. I nixed that move, scared that I would drop Vivian. Carl suggested that he alter the choreography so that he would catch Vivian. Vivian liked the idea, but I emphatically vetoed it. She was marrying me, not Carl. Even without that finale, our dance down the aisle was epic. Carl was so handsome and such a great dancer that all the aunts, female cousins, and female friends danced with him. He and Vivian danced together several times. They were amazing dancers and everyone applauded. He was really the star of my wedding, not me. 2 years after that, our son was born, and we became the newest members of the No Sleep for Mom and Dad Club. With a 9-week-old child who kept us awake throughout the night, it was no surprise that my wife, Vivian, and I had little closeness. The doctor said we had to wait for 8 weeks after the child was born to be intimate, but I couldn't even get a hug from my wife. Anyway, we were too exhausted, I guess. My wife is a dance instructor, and as I previously said, I'm a waiter at a high-end Manhattan restaurant called Sinatra's. Obviously, I work most nights, and starting about a year ago, my wife began acting distant towards me. Then she became pregnant, which surprised me because I use protection. I guess that one of those suckers had slipped off or something. My wife had gone back to work 3 weeks earlier and spent those Saturday nights out with her girlfriends. I didn't begrudge her this time because she had suffered through a difficult pregnancy that kept her bedridden for the last 2 months. Susan, my restaurant manager, was very understanding about the times I had to care for my wife and miss a shift. Our team at the restaurant was very supportive of one another, and I always got someone to cover for me. I also understood that Vivian needed time away from our demanding son. I didn't anticipate how much an infant could cry despite constant feeding and diaper changes. I quickly realized that caring for a baby is the most intensive job on earth. He demanded never-ending attention. I'm ashamed to say that I looked forward to leaving my home and going to work, so I wasn't surprised that it seemed my wife felt the same way. I never suspected that my wife could be unfaithful. I did whatever I could to take care of her during her pregnancy. When she was bedridden, I waited on her like a slave. The only time she had to get out of bed was to use the bathroom. I sensed, however, that she wasn't grateful for my attention, but was annoyed by my constant presence. She would beg me to leave her for a few hours so she could be alone, but I followed her doctor's orders and only left when either her mother or mine could attend to her. That just made her angry with me. Her boss and co-workers from the dance studio where they all worked came to visit once or twice a week, and that's when she lit up with happiness. I assumed that soon the baby would sleep through the night and our marriage would return to normal. I asked my dad, who told me it was normal for a newborn to change everything including intimacy, for a while, but eventually things would settle down. Unfortunately, he was wrong. I tried being extra loving to my wife. One night while she was working, I brought roses to her studio. She was upset and said I should never again bother her when she was working. That was a real slap in the face, but it would soon get much worse. "Tim, I'm no longer in love with you, Vivian," my 28-year-old wife said as she walked down the stairs into our kitchen. I was feeding our 6-week-old son, who delighted in spitting out food all over me. Frank Sinatra sang on the radio. What kind of fool am I? It seemed like a metaphor for my wife's attitude towards me based on what she just said. "Tim, now that I can again have intimacy, I'm leaving for a date with Kevin. You're too submissive. I need a stronger alpha male. My boss Kevin is coming to pick me up in a moment. He earns twice what you make, and he's twice your size and twice as aggressive, so don't get any macho ideas. Vivian worked for Kevin at his dance studio. They were both dance teachers. So you've been cheating on me? I asked. Well, it's only fair, she angrily responded, since you've been cheating throughout our marriage. What are you talking about? I stammered. She folded her arms in front of her. I know how you visited the grave of your first wife with her parents on her birthday. In my book, that's cheating. It was true that when I was troubled, I visited my late wife's grave, but how on earth was that cheating? When Vivian moved into my apartment, we had a major fight over the photo of my wedding to Lenore that hung on the wall. Vivian insisted that I remove it. I absolutely refused. I never compared Vivian to Lenore or spoke of my first marriage. Vivian complained that she never brought up her old boyfriends or put their photos on the wall. She couldn't or wouldn't understand the difference. My enduring love for my first wife didn't affect my love for Vivian, but I guess she refused to see it that way, or maybe it was just a convenient excuse for her. I took a moment to digest what my wife just said as I wiped food from my son's face and also mine. I took a sip of grape juice from a large glass. My wife was dressed in a tight white dress and looked like a high-priced hooker as she spoke to me. I'm going out on a date. Please be mature and don't try to stop me. I heard a car pull up in our driveway and honk its horn. A tidal wave of anger took hold of me. I wouldn't dream of it, I said as I spilled the bottle of grape juice all over her hair, face, and dress. Then I got up, withdrew an item from the cutlery drawer, and walked out the front door to the waiting car. Carl Evans, my wife's boss, sat in his Tahoe with the window open. I walked up to him and smiled. I pulled his head out of the window by his long Fabio-length hair. Then I placed the knife at his throat. I thought of punching him out, but chose not to. Why leave evidence of an assault? If you ever so much as speak to my wife again, while I'm many miles away, you'll be mugged and have your balls cut off. I turned and walked back into my house as I heard his car drive quickly away. Moments later, my wife stormed out of the house, with grape juice dripping from her hair, carrying our son. Don't take my son, I screamed as Carl's car returned to the front of our house. He's not your biological son. My soon-to-be ex-wife screamed back. He's Carl's son, and she drove away with Carl. The shock and pain of once again losing a child and wife was so intense that I couldn't yet process it. I quickly packed a bag with important documents, my laptop, and several $1,000s from the safe. I worked primarily for cash tips and always kept a lot of cash in our home safe. I parked my car down the block and waited to see if I was in legal trouble. 30 minutes later, I saw 2 police officers ringing my doorbell. I drove to Starbucks, and between my sobs and tears over my lost wife and lost son, I used my laptop computer to close all our bank accounts and joint credit cards. I felt I had to get some kind of revenge for what they did to me. I transferred the money to my personal account at another bank in another state. I had the phone company, electric company, and shut-off service to our rented house. Then I canceled my cell phone and my ex-wife's. I didn't know how I was able to accomplish all that with so many tears in my eyes and so much hatred in my heart. I drove to my sister's house, where we filled out the paperwork transferring ownership of my car to her. I phoned an airline and made a one-way reservation to Brazil, but didn't pay for it. Then my sister drove me to the Pennsylvania train station. There I bought a ticket from New York to Philadelphia for cash. I'd never been in Philadelphia, so it was unlikely that the police would look for me there, or that I would run into anyone I knew. I wasn't just running away from the law. I was trying to run away from myself, to outrun the pain. I checked into a motel that required ID, but the clerk changed her mind after I gave her $100. The old me had suffered too much pain. I needed to be someone else, not just to hide from the cops, but to hide from my past. I went to a cemetery and found the grave of Charles Shields, a child born a month after I was born who died at 5 years of age. I put flowers on his grave as a thank you for lending me his identity. I also promised him that I wouldn't bring shame to his name. I went to the nearest Home Depot store and spoke with several Latin men who waited outside as they offered help lifting heavy things into trucks or working at the customer's house. I asked about where to buy a fake ID. I went to that address, and for $250, I had a new driver's license complete with my photo in the name of the Charles Shields, the deceased child. I went to the local free library and obtained a library card. The next morning, I went to City Hall, and with my forged documents as proof as to who I was, I obtained a copy of my birth certificate and then off to the nearest Social Security office. At first, I was denied a card until I explained that I didn't have a card at my age because I had belonged to a religious cult since childhood and wasn't allowed to obtain one. I applied and received a learner's permit, and a month later I took and passed the driving test. Now that I owned legitimate documents, I burned the fakes. I got a job at a modestly priced chain restaurant as a waiter, which was my job in New York. That night I had earned enough in cash tips to keep going. I worked there for a month and saved every dime, while living in a low-rent flop house that reeked of urine. I didn't own a TV or read books. I spent my spare time plotting my revenge on Carl. I wouldn't hurt Vivian, however, not because she was a woman, but because her son needed her to care for him. I read a New York newspaper and learned that an arrest warrant had been issued for me for spousal abuse, but the police believed that I had traveled to Brazil. My wife and her boss claimed that I beat the hell out of both of them. That was a lie. They obtained a restraining order against me mandating that I stay at least 500 feet away from them. I was forbidden to call or even write to them. 3 months later, when I thought the heat on me had cooled off, I heard Frank Sinatra on the radio station that only played Sinatra, singing, "I'll Be Home for Christmas," followed by "Going to Take a Sentimental Journey." I knew that I too had to take that sentimental journey home. I traveled back to New York incognito thanks to my COVID mask. My first task was to visit the grave of my first wife and unborn child to bring them up to date on my sorry excuse of a life and tell them how much I still loved and missed them. I now called my unborn son Charles, after the dead child whose identity I stole as a sort of expiation. I owned the plot next to Lenore's and wished I could be buried there now. I bought a gray-haired wig and a heavy walking cane as both a weapon and part of my disguise. I waited until closing time at Carl's dance studio. Because it was Christmas time and snowing, it was pitch black outside. I followed Carl out of the building as he walked through the drifting snow towards a nearby subway station. As he began to walk down the snow-covered long, steep flight of stairs, I grabbed his right ankle with the hooked end of my cane. He flew down the stairs face first, screaming. I didn't wait to assess the damage, but kept walking down the street. I found a trash can blocks away, far from any streetlights or security cameras, and threw my disguise into it. I didn't know if he understood that he was assaulted. He may have thought that he merely tripped on the snow-covered steps. I badly wanted to tell him what I did to him, but I used my head and didn't. Why invite an arrest warrant and prison sentence? A month later, I again traveled to NYC to phone my sister. I was worried that her phone might be tapped, so I didn't phone from Philadelphia. My sister also informed me that my ex-wife had filed for divorce for me on grounds of abandonment and changed her son's father's name to Carl, with the help of a DNA test. Apparently, Carl was no longer so handsome. His nose, collarbone, left leg, left arm, and 3 teeth were broken. Even Carl believed that he slipped on the ice-covered subway steps. Most of his income from his studio was based on his ability to lead various dance classes and give very private lessons to lonely women seeking affection from a handsome man. Now, of course, that was impossible. The fact that he no longer had such a handsome face also discouraged most of his potential female clientele from taking any more of his classes. His income dropped precipitously as a result. Vivian now worked a lot of overtime at the studio to try and keep it going, but she lacked the appeal that most of their women clients wanted. They wanted to dance with a handsome man who held them tightly for an hour or so each week and made them feel beautiful and desired. I always suspected that based on his smug attitude and flirtatious nature that some of those special dance lessons were horizontal hip-hops in the back room for which he was paid handsomely, please pardon the pun. These women drifted off to other studios with handsome instructors. Vivian soon got a job at another studio, but Carl was unemployable as a dance instructor and had no other skills other than seducing married women. My sister checked with the police and the district attorney about any current arrest warrants issued for me. There were none. I was free to return to New York if I so chose. I liked Philadelphia, but New York was my home. That's where Lenore was buried. My friends and family lived, so I returned. I used my real name and identification to resume my life there. I contacted Susan, my former restaurant manager, and asked for my job back. Susan was happy to hear my voice. She said she missed me, then she hugged me and hired me. I had always been attracted to Susan, but I had been married to Lenore and didn't cheat on my wife or even flirt with Susan, who was also married and a good friend of Lenore's. Susan also liked me, but we didn't let it escalate. Her husband was a soldier serving in Iraq, and she was a faithful woman. Even if she had been willing and I was single, I would never sleep with the wife of a soldier, deployed or otherwise. Now that I was back, I learned to my sorrow that Susan's husband died around the same time that I left Vivian. Now, since I didn't count my marriage to Vivian, but only to Lenore, I was a widower and Susan was a widow. Before Lenore died, Susan and I would tell jokes to each other at work and laugh all the time. Now we were both too somber. Our wounds were still too fresh. I wasn't yet ready to try a new relationship, and I didn't think that Susan was either, but maybe in time. On my second night of working, I served dinner to the sister-in-law of my ex-wife. We had always gotten along and she didn't create a scene. I told her that I never beat up Vivian but had poured grape juice on her new dress that she was wearing to entertain her lover. That was a far cry from the fable that Vivian had told everyone. Once Carl was ugly and penniless, my ex-wife left him for another man, who quickly grew tired of her and threw her out of his apartment. Vivian's parents were raising her son. Vivian viewed her son as an impediment to her very active love life. According to her sister-in-law, Vivian used her job as a dance instructor to meet men who paid her for closeness. 2 nights later, Vivian showed up alone at the restaurant and demanded that I forgive her. Sinatra sang on the radio, 3 coins in a fountain. He should have sung, "The lady is a tramp," but things don't always work out perfectly. She wanted us to reconnect, or at least for me give her money. I explained the restraining order to my boss, Susan. She and 3 busboys forced Vivian to leave. If she remained, I could be arrested. Vivian did not leave quietly, but screamed that she would have me arrested. I went about my business, explaining to my customers that she was my crazy ex-wife. They took pity on me and left very generous tips. A day later, Vivian phoned me at the restaurant crying and screaming. Her boyfriend du jour had beaten her up for reasons I didn't care to hear about. She wanted me to come over to rescue her and begged me allow her to live in my apartment. She claimed she was now sorry for the way she had treated me. It was all a mistake, because she always loved me and she would make it up to me in bed. I lied and told her that I'd really love to come over, but because of the restraining order, I didn't want to get arrested. I hung up and never again heard from her. Then I took a 5-minute break, went into the back alley, leaned against a wall and cried. I mourned the loss of my 2 marriages and 2 children. I had really loved Vivian until she broke my heart. Susan, my manager, came out, put her arms around me, and hugged me from behind. When I turned around, she kissed me and I returned it with interest. Susan said she loved me. I melted. I don't know what the future holds, but now I believe that we have a future. We walked hand in hand back into the restaurant to hear Frank Sinatra. He was once again right as he sang, "The best is yet to come." Dear listeners, sending loads of love to Ronald Burns for his contribution, and to all our listeners, thank you for being part of this literary journey with us. You can check out Ron's work at Amazon, and we have shared the links in the description box below. And if you want to share your work with us, please send your work at the email mentioned in the description box, and we will publish it for our listeners at Lost Love Chronicles. Please share your thoughts in the comments section, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.